I would be the first to say that Mobile Suit Gundam Iron-Blooded Orphans makes a poor first impression. A jaded anime viewer is going to take one look at the title, two looks at the synopsis, spy that Mario Okada has a writing credit, suck some air through their teeth, and say, I know exactly what kind of show this is going to be. They're going to lean in on the tragic child soldier angle as if it hasn't been a part of every Gundam series ever. There's going to be a lot of overwrought melodrama and bloviating about ends justifying the means. It's going to be paper thin and a pain in the ass, and nobody over the age of 16 will ever take it seriously. If you come in feeling uncharitable, there's little that will disabuse you of that in the first few episodes. Ooh, edgy twist. The boy soldiers dispose of their masters to go into business for themselves. They're going to be escorting this cute rich girl around. They're actually taking the implicit class divide of this interaction seriously. But why is this girl and her agenda important anyways? Well, she's here to do the revolution, and by revolution, she means going in front of the Metropolitan Parliament to renegotiate the Martian mineral rights, to give the colony of Christ some meaningful economic opportunities, creating a potential for self-determination and political independence. Wait a minute. Someone cooked here. There's real politics and history in the pot instead of the usual deep-fried headline pastiche. In much the same way all the elder political operators in the story are immediately struck with what a clear-eyed and carefully scoped agenda this is. This is a big establishing moment for how thoughtfully this show was constructed as a whole. I feel silly for not having watched Iron-Blooded Orphans before making like 3 videos about Universal Century Gundam, because it feels like the writers of IBO shared much of the complaints that I made in those videos and had long ago addressed them in an eloquent way. In the overarching plot and broader setting of Iron-Blooded Orphans, you can tell who is going to be important and impactful on the world by seeing who doesn't pilot a mobile suit. The fate of the world will not rest on the shoulders of a couple boys in big powerful toys. The conflicts are a lot more complex than that. The core of the show's storytelling is the fighters at the end of the day, but the world isn't contorted to make them the center of the universe. Or you could say, there is an awareness that this is what warped the world in the first place. In the distant past, Gjallarhorn, the supranational peacekeeper overlord of the setting, was founded by, well, a bunch of mecha savants who sound suspiciously like Gundam main characters, playing out what sounds like it could be the plotline of a Gundam series in order to end a calamitous interplanetary war. In the outcome I would have predicted, by the time IBO takes place, the pilotocracy has become a despotic hereditary aristocracy sitting a throne on bayonets, having completely forgotten any purpose or ideals they may have held beyond maintaining their dominance. And that's before we get to the direct rebuke of the notion that social legitimacy and political power flows from the shiniest Gundam, that the pilot seat should be the pilot seat of history. This isn't to say that the Gundam pilots aren't the main characters of this show. Mikazuki August encapsulates the ethos of this series quite well in that he is just a pilot, just a soldier. He is disinterested by the grand strategy and politics happening around him. He's just here to fight. But Mikazuki believes in his buddy and great leader Orga above anything else, and is his greatest hype man. Mikazuki is not easily dismissed as any one mecha main character archetype. You could say that he's the child soldier doormat, because he is literally a child soldier and has a flat affect. But he displays an ego and doesn't exhibit the kinds of hang-ups or panic attacks associated with that kind of character. He may have girls all over him, but in the paradoxical world of anime sexuality, the fact that he can be assertive with women and uses the cockpit in a manner congruent to its name is a strong indicator that the writers are not trying to make Mika an easy self-insert power fantasy for boys in the target demographic. Above all, there's an unearthly coldness about Mr. August as he shoots a defeated foe in the middle of their tragic monologue in the second episode. Even if he's a teenager, and as much as reading, writing, and the softer things in life surprise him, Mika and his comrades exude a sense of being old, utterly unsurprised by war and death and betrayal, jaded, scarred, traumatized, whatever you want to call it. Someone once pointed out to me that a unique feature of the original Mobile Suit Gundam was that the mobile suits and the war their advancement precipitated are new to the setting and feel like it. The characters have a tangible sense of shock and unfamiliarity to mirror that of the audience. Much of the drama comes from how inexperienced the main cast is, and how nobody really knows what mobile suits are capable of. Now, through cultural osmosis, people know what a mecha is and the lay of the land, even if they have never watched a Gundam series. But while no Gundam since has really taken it from the top like 0079, in much the same way Fate doesn't take 5 to 14 business days explaining the Holy Grail War anymore, I would argue that Iron-Blooded Orphans is among the first to truly internalize the fact that Gundam is so old and so familiar. Mobile suits are common and have canonically been around for centuries in Iron-Blooded Orphans, whereas most Gundam timelines have living characters who remember a time before mobile suits. The true Gundams, with the familiar designs, are all relics of a bygone society. The eldritch power level of a complete Gundam is only a shock because everyone is very comfortable and familiar with what a mobile suit is supposed to be. When our heroes throw out a cloud of chaff in a successful ploy to escape, the enemy fleet commanders don't just scream and act confused as to why their sensors don't work. They know what chaff is and start burning it off like they practiced in drills. The basics are not overly surprising to anyone after centuries of warfare. At risk of cliché, the world of Iron-Blooded Orphans feels lived in, as if institutions and society have settled into a fitting shape over the years, as if characters really belong to this world as opposed to being transplants from ours. But where things have been lived in, there is of course some baggage. Our protagonists get their superhuman piloting abilities from the poorly named neural implants, a barbaric, invasive procedure that kills many recipients and progressively disables those who use it too heavily. During the previous years of instability, our protagonists were forcefully implanted as child soldiers, making them space rats. On the face of this is kind of edgy and grimdark, but I find it much more interesting than new types in the Universal Century. The concept of natural new types always stinks of generational determinism. The young will be increasingly enlightened, more capable, and more empathetic, inevitably leading humanity onto a new path. It's a charming notion, but one that's several generations old, so it's safe to call it naive by this point. Later UC tries to come to grips with this, in making all of the primary villains new types. But there's still an implication that change and revolution is an inherent natural force of the setting, beyond the mere efforts of men. Even though they are all teenagers, space rats are not the future, but relics of an unpleasant past taking one last ride. The kinder future they are fighting for will hopefully have fewer people built for combat, not more. There is no promise to an end to history, where everyone will inherently understand each other and get along. But there are people willing to grasp at a better world. Kudelia Ina Bernstein is instantly out of place here, the posh pretty girl full of optimism among the hard-bitten child mercenaries. She saw the homeless or bonded children of the Martian colony and developed a burning desire to do something about it. The cynic in me sees the youthful activist naivete and instantly generates bile. Knowing who Marx is merely displaced knowing how to make the blood sign among sheltered suburban youth. But I think that's the reception Kudelia is expected to have with some of the audience, and ultimately, unjustifiably so. Kudelia is not one of those kids professing extreme but abstract political views as a fashion statement. She's someone with immediately concrete and achievable goals. The wonderfully doe-eyed image she brings gives her power, but she's willing to make unsavory deals and practical compromises to make things happen. There's a whole rogues gallery that Kudelia has to step on or over in her path to power. Noblest Gordon is her initial financial backer, a cigar-smoking slimeball who presumably has a secretary on his balls during every call. He's a calculating businessman who has chosen to hedge his bets. Either there's a successful Martian independence movement, which he can profit from, or there will be more banditry and wars, which he will also profit from. To that end, he secretly intends to martyr Kudelia in front of the cameras, rather than let her actually reach her objective. If there's anything likable about Mr. Nobilis, it is how grounded and banal his villainy is. He's purely motivated by greed, and his plans are uncomplicated. There's no moment where he cackles and reveals some grand, world-encompassing plan. Even Cordelia, at her most naive, understands the kind of scum she's dealing with. A lesser show would make a character like this a grand chess master who spins the universe around his finger. In IBO, the setting is too complex for that. No one truly has that power. Ultimately, Nobilis just shifts a few pieces around the board, to results he was unable to predict. There's a refreshing sense of political reality in this setting. Everyone talks in a way that's at least a little believable for their station, instead of, like, Gundam villains. It's not about grand ideologies or masterful planning. It's about people making hard, unclean decisions in circumstances not of their choosing. Take Biscuit's brother, who is nominally the antagonist for an episode. He's in the unenviable position of being the trusted negotiator with labor unions on the Dort colonies when he has no ability to provide concessions and good reason to believe that Gjallarhorn will just come in and slaughter everyone in the event of a serious protest, which will happen if no concessions are made. The idea of grabbing some random teenage activist the authorities seem to want and trading her for a compromise settlement seems eminently reasonable. The needs of the many outweigh the needs of some rich bitch with curls. Tekkadan actually stopping Gjallarhorn's fist was completely outside anyone's expectations besides the audience of a hot-blooded mecha series. So it's only in retrospect that Big Bro looks completely wrong. Here's something I find funny. I think if you just read a synopsis of Gundam 00, which usually starts with like a 5-paragraph essay on the geopolitical state of the setting, and then read a synopsis of IBO, which often emphasizes the edge, I think one would assume that the following sequence came from the latter show. Main character flies around the world at hypersonic speed, creeps into the bedroom of a head of state who happens to be a cute girl, asks,
"Tell me, why is this world so twisted?"
Huh?
Vanishes like Batman before she can formulate a response. But the reality is that Iron-Blooded Orphans is well balanced. It has it both ways. This is a show which has both thoughtful, sensible plot and world building, and a cast of well-realized characters. The principles of Double D's only got more fleshed out in one particular way. For the most part, IBO maintains a good sense of momentum. The characters smartly drive the plot forward, and the character drama is largely reactive to those developments. The part where the show most noticeably stumbles, the first half of Season 2, is figuratively and literally static. Tekkadan is settled in place and is just reacting to threats coming at them, and a lot of the focus falls on a part of the cast whose fate is made a foregone conclusion. The audience knows they are betrayed, and it's just a constant build of tension until the blade falls on obvious death flags. Perhaps there's a deliberate allegory here, the transition from mobile suit bandits to stationary bureaucratic bandits. But it does mean that there is at least a quarter of Iron-Blooded Orphans which I don't find at all engaging. In enjoying the broader plot and world building so much, I must admit I am becoming invested in a relatively peripheral part of the series. What I've realized from watching a few Gundam shows and timelines is that the setting is rarely all that fleshed out. It's world building in broad strokes. You get scant insights into how ordinary people live here and what their concerns are at the ground level, especially if you don't accept every line of dialogue as reliable narration. There is nothing conclusive in the text to tell you where the scale and validity of Zeon's grievances with the Federation fall between the Saint-Domain uprising and Brexit. The conflict is kind of a blank slate for the viewer's sympathies and biases to fill in. By that token, I could argue, without too much sophistry, that the world of Iron-Blooded Orphans actually represents the terminal state of a Soviet Union-esque federation of command economies. Not that you should. Gjallarhorn is clearly intended as a non-denominational ancien regime, but you could, in the absence of real details. Mind you, there's absolutely nothing wrong with compromising on fidelity like this. It's just an economical way to write a story and make it relatable and understandable to the widest possible audience. But this is always what I'm thinking when people spend too much time with the politics of Gundam or claim that there's some overly specific political allegory. No matter broader themes or the supposed sympathies of the creators, it is so rarely the primary focus of the text that it just doesn't end up being that specific at the end of the day. But I think this is less true for the last quarter of Iron-Blooded Orphans, where many Gundam series tend to compress at their ending, boiling down to a personal battle between a shrinking subset of the protagonists and antagonists. IBO actually expands, politely wrapping up the individual plot lines in the background of a grand narrative. Essentially, the second season is the smoldering political squeeze that ultimately ignites a civil war inside Gjallarhorn. Tekkadan, because of a past relationship and a vague sense of standing against the current order of things, has ended up in the orbit of McGillis Farid. McGillis has clawed his way up from the bottom, literally, and wants to reshape the organization in what he sees as the true image of its founder. Since McGillis is sitting in Char's place, the roguish rival deuteragonist seat, the audience is not expected to think too hard about what his ideology means and what exactly his image of the future is. Opposing him is Rustal Elion, admiral of the Arianrod fleet. He wants to preserve the order and prestige of Gjallarhorn at all costs. He is an incredibly shrewd operator who never holds the idiot ball and does not miss a trick. He doesn't underestimate McGillis's pet mercenaries because they're a bunch of low-born teenagers. He understands exactly what a threat a bunch of juiced-up veteran fighters in ludicrously powerful mobile suits is, and spends an entire season methodically isolating and demolishing Tekkadan by any and all means. Because he's in the obligatory villain chair, you're not expected to think too hard about what order Elion is trying to preserve and what he might do to preserve it. There are two things that make Rustal Elion so competent. The first is that he is an utter cynic who is willing to take any position that benefits him and Gjallarhorn, no matter how hypocritical it makes him look. Condemn criminality while throwing around bribes, start proxy wars while talking about order, profess meritocracy while grooming a successor. But his most important and most telling characteristic is that he's an excellent leader. It's not psychic Charles Manson Riz, but people are willing to die for him because he treats his subordinates and allies well and doesn't expose them to any unnecessary risks. For all the depths of ruthlessness he plumbs to destroy his enemies, he is honest and pays his debts. It is quite a contrast to McGillis, whose defining character moment is a brutal personal betrayal of the two people who loved him most and thought him a friend. Not just killing the guy, but promising to play ass-naked Twister with his sister as soon as she's of age. So it's not really a surprise that despite a few setbacks, Elion continuously outmaneuvers McGillis until the latter is forced to go all in. As is so easily forgotten, Gjallarhorn was founded by a Gundam protagonist, Agnika Kaoru, and his spirit lives on in his Gundam, Bile, hidden beneath Gjallarhorn HQ. According to the ancient laws, whoever pilots Bile is the ruler of Gjallarhorn, and all must bend the knee to him. But of course, strange mech suits lying in basements distributing neural implants is no basis for a system of government. When McGillis takes Gjallarhorn HQ and the Gundam, it doesn't actually give him the keys to the kingdom, seeing as Rustal Elion subscribes to the school of bigger army politics and has the Arianrod fleet under his control. The largest factions of Gjallarhorn are not keen on dying and decide to neither obey nor disobey McGillis, just sit things out and see what happens, which is a pretty astute observation of how military commanders tend to behave during attempted coups in real life. So Tekkadan is one of the few cards that McGillis has to play when the time finally comes for the grand confrontation with the Arianrod fleet. Elion reveals that he's been stockpiling illegal railguns this whole time and willing to stage a false flag attack to legitimize using them. So McGillis's little fleet of rogue cadets gets absolutely slaughtered. Tekkadan plays their big desperate gambit to assassinate Elion, and the smug look on his face right on the citadel of his flagship, and it misses. taking a gay romance with it. You can imagine how the story would progress if they'd hit their shot, but history just doesn't go that way. Which, after a disgraceful retreat, leads us to McGillis's final stand. He still has bile and the soul of Kaoru on his side. The Gundam can always beat whole fleets of lesser machines, with a righteous pilot. Except for the fact that Galio, the guy who McGillis supposedly killed and whose sister he fistered, is back with his own Neuralink-enabled Gundam, and is not keen to have second thoughts based on McGillis's ideological ravings. So while it's a knockdown, drag-out fight, Galio kills McGillis, and I start to wonder, why have we been on McGillis's side this whole time? Since antiquity, people have habitually associated success at arms with correctness and legitimacy. McGillis dying and his coup failing breaks a spell. You start thinking about how this guy is a fascist, and not in the social scare word sense. He's a progressive, revolutionary figure who nonetheless idolizes some glorious bygone past. He values military strength and personal strength above all else. You could not come up with a more textbook fascism, right down to the emasculation. And beyond that, he's morally as much, if not more of a bad person than Rustal-Elion or anyone else in his camp. McGillis Farid fits a particular anime character archetype, right down to the blonde of his hair. Dreams of a shining castle on a hill, a ladder built of the dead. Except, the castle McGillis dreams of seems to be a very grim place. I am not sympathetic to his ends, but disgusted by his means, as one might be for Griffith. McGillis's goals are terrible. The audience is just lulled into thinking that he might be a good guy or a loyal rival, because his means just happen to include being a temporary patron for the protagonists. He promised Orga the power to realize his ambitions on Mars, but it's easy to read McGillis's bigger agenda as going against Orga's. More war, more child soldiers, the rule of the strong and all against all. So, in what position does this leave Tekkadan? They've just acted as a spearhead for a coup, which has failed, and they've never actually had the power to fight the Leviathan all on their own. Rustal-Elion refuses Orga's surrender. To cement the legitimacy of Gjallarhorn, he has to publicly crush Tekkadan. There can be no easy way out from treason. It's not quite as dire as it could be. They do secure an escape route, but all of Tekkadan's remaining fighters have to fight a rearguard action to buy time before they blow the charges and fake their deaths. And it is truly a glorious stand, as we see the true power of Gundams at their peak against the common mobile suits of this era. But when it looks like Mikazuki and Akihiro might actually kill their way out of this one, and have conveniently disposed of another potential Gjallarhorn leader, Rustal-Elion leaves nothing to chance, bombarding the site from orbit and leaving his Dotaru to do the photogenic mopping up. Mika and Aki die on their feet, but they die nonetheless. This comes as a shocking turnabout, especially if you aren't in tune with all the fatalism that's associated with Tekkadan's pilots. But it's what happens after the time skip that really astonishes me. In the wake of the crisis, Rustal-Elion has swept aside the old Gjallarhorn aristocracy, reforming it into an electoral democracy of some kind, though he is conspicuously its first president. We see him signing a bill outlawing child soldiering alongside Kudelia on a newly self-determining Mars, and turning a blind eye to the escaped survivors of Tekkadan, who she now employs. Tekkadan the organization is now nothing but a villainous footnote in history, a monstrous force that collaborated with the usurper McGillis. Without Orga and without their mobile suits, they are thoroughly extinguished, even if some members continue to fight on in the shadows. I see a lot of reactions to this conclusion, about how it's a grimdark ending where the bad guys win, but I read it as a lot more nuanced than that. I don't think the show is presenting a conclusive opinion, but I think it's asking the viewer to ask a lot of hard questions about who they have been sympathetic to and why. It turns out that opposite the outright fascism of McGillis, Elion is a conservative in the mold of Bismarck, one who bends and compromises to preserve the essence of the regime, rather than break to preserve its form. When he said at the beginning of the second season that Gjallarhorn's role was to protect peace and order, and that it didn't matter who did the protecting, he kind of meant it. He was willing to liquidate the aristocracy of which he was a part if it would preserve Gjallarhorn's role and power. It's another contrast to McGillis, who despite his humble background seemed ready to reinforce the chivalric, autocratic vision of Gjallarhorn. Add 2 more names who allegedly had the "so we are both traitors to our class" exchange. There's a swathe of opinion online to the effect that this ending is somehow an unbelievable character turn for Russell Elliott, which is a bit baffling to me. Elliott is a ruthless son of a bitch, but did I miss a scene where he says he's a divine right aristocrat who opposes democracy on principle? Did I sleep through the part of history class about how the founders of democracy are consistently nice and morally uncomplicated folks? I don't think this makes Elliott a good person, and it's not like every new democracy succeeds. But I don't see the mystery in a character doing something which is entirely consistent with their goals and philosophy. The core premise of this show requires one to accept the contradiction of a private military corporation staffed by child soldiers becoming a positive force for moral ends. The idea that a power politician could turn a blood-soaked bureaucratic state into a slightly more pleasant and pluralist one should not be so hard to swallow. Another line that I see is that Tekkedon's defeat is some kind of total out-of-left-field surprise, or that our characters got saddled with the idiot ball. Barring the exogenous expectations that people bring to a hot-blooded mecha anime, I don't really see it. It's very clear from the beginning that Orga bargaining with McGillis is tying Tekkedon's fate to his in a very dangerous gamble. Russell Elliott controls a vast amount of resources, and it's always been clear that this is a world where a few main characters in Gundams are not enough to fight a nation. The Sovereign rarely falls prey to revolution, given moderately competent leadership. Tekkedon is materially overmatched. Without the romantic narrative preference that fiction usually gives to rebels and underdogs, they can do everything right and still lose. That's life. And despite it all, everything has kind of turned out Tekkedon's way for now. The bulk of their members enter normal civilian life as intended. Mars is now prosperous. Law and order means fewer child soldiers. And the apparent next generation of Gjallarhorn leadership seems pretty enlightened. Of course, this all hangs in the balance of how much good faith Russell Elliott is actually acting in, which the audience has reason to question after all we've seen. But there's no stinger after the credits of him building a Death Star. I think this could not be more the opposite of a nihilistic ending. It's very clear that, even if they ended up on the wrong side and lost, the world is actually a better place for all the blood, sweat, and tears of Tekkedon. Our young heroes struck the first blow that overturned the old world and made room for a new one, even if they didn't all live to see. Their heirs have a republic now, if they can keep it. There's a pretty stark contrast between this and the Universal Century, where every series sees millions dead and Earth getting nuked and exotic new flavors of commie-stroke-fascist giving grand speeches, and yet nothing ever happens. Zeon or the Feddies, or whoever you imagine to be the bad guys, are always back for another round. This is in part an artifact of the business model, but I think it also belies a sense of socio-political nihilism that society and humanity does not learn and is undeserving salvation. Iron-Blooded Orphans may have a certain cynicism of the intellect, but it has an optimism of the will. This is a cold, cold world, but the characters actually make it a better place in practical, non-supernatural ways. It's inspiring stuff, and I think it deserves a lot more recognition than it has gotten.